I almost opened it. The box was sitting on the kitchen counter when I came in. Plain brown paper. My name written in a way that looked familiar enough not to question. There was a small tag taped to the top. "That's what you deserve." It sounded like something my parents would say as a joke, the kind that didn't quite land but wasn't meant to. I picked up the box, turned it slightly in my hands. My dad was standing a few steps behind me. He hadn't said anything until then. "Don't move." His voice was low, not loud, but it stopped me. I glanced back at him, expecting to see irritation or maybe confusion. Instead, he was staring at the box in a way I hadn't seen before, his attention fixed on one corner like it mattered more than the rest. I smiled anyway. "It's just a gift." He didn't respond. He took a small step forward, then stopped himself. "Put it down." That was when I followed his eyes. There was something along the edge, thin and out of place, like it didn't belong with the rest of the packaging. I hadn't noticed it before. Once I did. I couldn't ignore it. I set the box down carefully and stepped back. Neither of us spoke after that. He reached for his phone. I stood where I was, watching the box. The police arrived faster than I expected. First one car, then another, lights reflecting off the windows and spilling across the floor. They asked us to move outside. Someone took over the space we had just been standing in. From the sidewalk, I watched them carry the box out. Slow and controlled. No one rushed, but no one treated it casually either. My name is Emily Carter, 32 years old. At that point, I thought the worst part of my week had already passed. It hadn't started with the package. It had started a week earlier, at my engagement dinner, when my father stood up in front of everyone and said something I couldn't take back once it was out in the open. The restaurant was quiet in a way that made every sound feel intentional. It was the kind of place Daniel's family preferred, polished and controlled, where nothing unpredictable was supposed to happen. We were celebrating something official, something stable. I hadn't realized I was walking into something already decided. Dinner had been going smoothly. Daniel sat beside me, his hand resting near mine, but not quite touching it. His father, Mr. Whitmore, watched everything with quiet attention, occasionally smiling at the right moments, never saying more than he needed to. My dad had been quieter than usual, but I assumed he was just out of place. That changed when he stood up. At first, I thought he was going to make a toast. He didn't raise his glass. He didn't look at anyone else. He looked directly at me. He had been quiet all evening, and later I would understand why. Someone had contacted him earlier that day. "She's not who you think she is," he said, his voice steady enough to carry across the table. No one moved. I felt the shift immediately, like something had tilted under me. "She received money recently," he continued, "from her mother's account, a large amount, and no one here seems to think that matters." I could feel people watching me, waiting for a response I wasn't prepared to give. "It was my inheritance," I said, keeping my voice even. "You knew that." He shook his head once, like I had confirmed something instead of correcting him. "You didn't tell them. That's the problem. Across from me, Mr. Whitmore didn't look surprised. He leaned back slightly, the corner of his mouth lifting just enough to notice. It wasn't a reaction to the moment. It felt like recognition. I turned to Daniel. He hadn't moved. He placed his hand lightly over mine under the table, just enough for others to see. "Say something," I said, quietly but clearly. He exhaled, then spoke without urgency. "It's not what it sounds like. We just need to be transparent about things like this." Transparent. That word landed harder than anything my father had said. I looked around the table and realized no one was on my side of it, not even him. I stood up before I could say something I couldn't take back and walked out without waiting for anyone to follow. I didn't hear about the prenup from Daniel. I found it sitting open on his desk 2 days after the dinner, printed and already marked in places that suggested someone had been through it carefully. I wasn't looking for it. I had gone into his office to leave something behind, and it was just there, placed in the center like it mattered more than anything else in the room. My name was on the first page. I stood there longer than I should have, reading enough to understand what it was and why I hadn't been told. Most of it was written in language that tried to sound neutral, but certain phrases were harder to ignore. Financial intent, asset protection, and one clause that stayed with me longer than the rest. If I demonstrated emotional instability or engaged in behavior that could be interpreted as financial manipulation, I would forfeit any claim to shared assets. I didn't remember agreeing to any of it. I tried to tell myself it was normal, something families like his always did. I stayed there longer than I should have, looking for a version of it that didn't feel personal. When Daniel came home, I didn't ease into the conversation. I handed him the document and watched his reaction before he even spoke. "You were going to tell me I said." He glanced down at the pages, then back at me, already composed. "It's standard. My family has always done this." "That clause isn't standard." I said, "That's a judgment waiting to happen. It's protection." He replied, his tone calm, almost practiced. "You're taking it personally when it's not about you. But it was about me, my behavior, my stability, my intent. Everything was being defined in terms I didn't control. I realized then that I wasn't being asked to build something with him. I was being measured against something that had already been decided. He reached for the document, but I didn't let go right away. For the first time, I understood that whatever this was, it wasn't starting from trust. At the time, I thought it was about money. I didn't realize it was about something much more controlled than that. A week passed without anything being resolved. It didn't feel like a week. It felt longer, stretched out by things we didn't say. We moved around each other carefully, like we were both waiting for the other person to decide what came next, but neither of us wanted to be the one to say it first. The anniversary came quietly. It was the day we first met. Something we had always marked in small ways. Dinner somewhere simple. A conversation that didn't feel forced. This time, there were no plans. Daniel mentioned it in the morning, almost as an afterthought, and I said I had work to finish. We let it go without discussion. The distance between us wasn't loud, but it was constant. Every interaction felt measured, like we were both aware of something we weren't addressing directly. The package arrived that afternoon. It was left just inside the front door, placed neatly enough to seem intentional. My name was written across the top in a way that looked familiar, which made me trust it more than I should have. I turned it over in my hands, noticing the weight, trying to place where it might have come from. The tag was taped to the top, the message written in the same handwriting. "That's what you deserve." For a moment, I thought it was connected to the anniversary. Something awkward but well-meaning. I picked up my phone and called my parents. "We didn't send anything," my mother said immediately. Before I could finish explaining, I looked back at the box, the words on it settling into something heavier than they had been a second before. It didn't feel like a joke anymore. My dad was still in the house when I carried the box into the kitchen. He didn't say anything at first, just watched me set it down on the counter like it belonged there. Then he stepped closer, not to touch it, but to look. "You smell that," he said. I didn't at first. Then I did. Faint and sharp. Something chemical that didn't match paper or tape. I leaned in slightly, trying to place it, but he reached out and stopped me before I got any closer. "Don't," he said, more firmly this time. I straightened, my hand still hovering near the edge of the box. He pointed to a section along the seam, where the paper didn't sit flat. There was something underneath it, thin and deliberate, like it had been placed there on purpose. "Step back," he said. I did. One step, then another, until I was standing near the doorway. He didn't move much either, just enough to create distance. The space between us and the counter felt suddenly important. He pulled out his phone. I didn't ask who he was calling. The police arrived quickly, faster than I expected for something that still didn't feel real. 2 officers came in first, asked us to leave the house, and kept their voices controlled but direct. Within minutes, more vehicles pulled up, and the street began to close off. From outside, I watched them move through the front door like they had done this before. No one rushed, but no one hesitated. A technician later explained that the device inside the box looked real enough to trigger a response, but later they said it wasn't built to cause a full explosion. The label on the package didn't lead anywhere. The address was correct, but everything else about it was false. I stood on the sidewalk, arms crossed without realizing it, watching them carry the box out of my house. For the first time, I felt exposed in a way I couldn't explain. Daniel arrived after the police had already taken control of the house. By then, the street was partially blocked off, and a few neighbors had gathered at a distance, watching without getting too close. He stepped out of his car, took in the scene once, and walked toward me without hesitation. I expected urgency, maybe confusion, something that matched how I felt. Instead, he was composed in a way that didn't fit. "What happened?" he asked, but his tone was steady, almost measured. I explained quickly, keeping it simple. The package, the note, my dad noticing something was wrong. He nodded as I spoke, like he was following a sequence he already understood. When the officers approached him, he answered clearly, giving short, precise responses. He didn't interrupt, didn't hesitate, and positioned himself slightly behind them where he could observe without being directly involved. Later, when we were standing a little apart from the others, he turned to me again. "Did you open it first?" he asked. "No," I said. I hadn't even started. "Did anyone else see it before your dad?" He paused, then added, "Are you okay?" The question came too late to feel real. "No." "Why does that matter?" He paused, just long enough to shift his tone. "I'm just trying to understand what they're going to think." He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't reach for me. Instead, he kept asking about details, about timing, about who had been present and what I had said. I answered him, but something in the way he spoke stayed with me. It felt less like concern and more like he was checking something against what he already knew. I didn't decide to go into Daniel's office all at once. It happened in smaller steps, the kind you don't question until you're already doing them. He had left early that morning, and I told myself I was only there to drop off a folder he had forgotten. I stood in the doorway longer than I needed to, looking at the desk, the closed laptop, the papers stacked too neatly to be casual. I walked in anyway. At first, nothing seemed out of place. Everything was organized, controlled, exactly how he liked it. I set the folder down, then noticed a second stack of documents tucked slightly to the side. Not hidden, but not meant to draw attention either. I pulled one out. It wasn't labeled in any obvious way, just a series of printed emails, short exchanges between Daniel and someone whose name I didn't recognize. The tone was direct, almost transactional. Dates, times, confirmations. I kept reading. There were references to my schedule. Specific days, places I had been, times I had left the house. One line mentioned a cafe I had gone to alone 3 days before the dinner. Another listed the time I arrived home that same night. I flipped to the next page. There were payment confirmations, amounts transferred in stages, not large enough to stand out on their own, but consistent enough to show a pattern. It wasn't random. It was planned. I told myself there had to be another explanation, something I hadn't seen yet. My hands slowed when I reached a message that didn't mention me directly, but didn't need to. Package delivered as instructed. No direct contact. Another line followed underneath. It only needs to look convincing. No actual detonation. I read it again, then once more. There was no explanation attached, no details spelled out. It didn't have to be. Everything around it filled in the gaps. I sat down without realizing it, the chair pulling slightly against the floor, for a second. I thought about closing everything, putting the papers back exactly where I found them, and walking out like none of it had happened. It would have kept things unclear. Instead, I kept reading. Each page made it harder to deny what I was looking at. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a coincidence tied together by timing. Someone had been watching me, reporting back, being paid to do it. And Daniel had been the one receiving it. By the time I stood up again, the hesitation I had felt before was gone. In its place was something steadier, something that didn't rely on guessing anymore. Whatever this was, it hadn't been random. I didn't confront Daniel right away. After leaving his office, I sat in my car longer than I intended, the engine off, the documents still open in my lap. I read through them again, slower this time, not looking for new information but for connections I might have missed the first time. They were all there. The prenup clause that focused on emotional instability, the timing of the accusations at dinner, the way my father had been led to believe something was wrong with the transfer from my mother's account. And now the surveillance, detailed enough to map my routine without me noticing. It wasn't separate incidents. It was one structure. The package wasn't meant to harm me immediately. It was meant to create a reaction, something visible, something that could be interpreted later. If I had opened it, panicked, said the wrong thing at the wrong time, it would have fit perfectly into the version of me they were building. It wasn't even meant to work the way it appeared. It just needed to feel real long enough for me to react. Unstable, unpredictable, not trustworthy with money or decisions. I closed the folder and rested my hands on it for a moment. It felt strange how clear it all was once I stopped trying to give him the benefit of the doubt. I had spent days adjusting my understanding, trying to make his behavior fit something reasonable. Now, I didn't need to. I thought about the version of him I had trusted, the one who had seemed careful, steady, someone I could rely on. That version didn't fit what I was holding in my hands anymore. Daniel hadn't been reacting to events. He had been setting them up. When I walked back into the house later that evening, he was already there, sitting in the living room like nothing had shifted. He looked up as I came in, calm as always, waiting for me to speak first. I didn't say anything. Not yet. There was a part of me that still wanted him to explain it in a way that would make it less deliberate, less controlled. But that part was smaller now, quieter than it had been before. What replaced it wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. He hadn't been trying to build a life with me. He had been building a case. I didn't go back to Daniel alone. The next morning, I met with 2 detectives from Chicago police at a quiet office downtown. I brought copies of everything I had taken from his desk, organized as carefully as I could manage. They didn't interrupt while I explained, only asked for clarification when something needed to be precise. By the time I finished, the room felt smaller. Not because of what I said, but because of how clearly it all fit together once spoken out loud. They didn't promise anything. They said they needed time to verify everything before taking action. One of them simply said, "We'll come with you." Daniel was at the house when we arrived. He opened the door, took one look at the 2 men standing behind me, and paused just long enough to show he understood this wasn't a conversation he could control. "What is this?" he asked, his voice still even, but tighter than before. I stepped inside without answering him directly. The detectives followed, introducing themselves, keeping the tone formal but firm. Daniel didn't argue, but I could see him recalculating, adjusting in real time. "This doesn't need to turn into something bigger," he said, looking at me now instead of them. "We can talk about it." I held his gaze. "You already made it bigger." They began asking questions, starting with the documents, the payments, the messages. Daniel responded carefully at first, choosing his words with the same precision I had seen in his emails. It was precaution. He said, "My family has responsibilities. There are risks," one of the detectives asked. Risks from who Daniel didn't answer immediately. He looked at me again, and something in his expression shifted. Not panic, but something closer to frustration. "I was protecting what's mine," he said. The room went still for a second. "Not ours. Mine." He continued speaking, trying to reframe it, to explain it as necessary, as controlled, as something justified by the circumstances he believed he was managing, but the words didn't land the same way anymore. The detectives exchanged a glance I didn't need explained. One of them stepped forward slightly, changing the tone of the room without raising his voice. At that point, it stopped being a conversation and became something official. The investigation didn't unfold all at once. It took weeks of interviews, paperwork, and waiting. It moved in steps, each one quieter than I expected, but heavier than the last. The detectives followed through on everything I had given them, tracing the payments, identifying the person Daniel had hired, and connecting it back to him in a way that didn't leave room for interpretation. Fraud and endangerment were the words they used. Formal charges followed, and his position in the company was suspended before the investigation even finished. Daniel didn't try to contact me after that day. His lawyer did. There were attempts to frame it as a misunderstanding, a situation taken too far, something that could still be resolved privately. I didn't respond. At that point, there wasn't anything left to negotiate. The engagement ended without a conversation between us. It became public before I had to say anything myself. People who had been at that dinner heard the rest of the story in pieces, and the version of me that had been quietly judged a week earlier didn't hold up against what came out next. "Mister?" Whitmore stayed silent through most of it, but that didn't protect him the way it might have before. The distance he had kept became part of the problem, not a shield from it. I kept what was mine, not because I fought harder, but because there was nothing left for them to take once the truth was documented. The note on the package stayed with me longer than anything else. "That's what you deserve." At first, I thought it was meant to humiliate me, to reduce me to something easier to dismiss. Now I understand it differently. It wasn't about what I deserved. It was about what they needed me to believe. If you've ever found yourself being quietly defined by someone else's version of you, pay attention to the pattern, not just to the moment. Control rarely looks obvious at the beginning. I didn't walk away from that week feeling stronger. I walked away understanding, and that was enough to make sure I wouldn't stay where I wasn't meant to.